Hi everyone. I recently finished reading Jane Eyre. I listened to it over a period of, I'd say, about 2 months. Although a lot of people read Jane Eyre at one point in school for the first time, I never did, so this is my very first time, and I really didn't even know the plot of it going into it. Because this is such an iconic work, and I feel ill equipped to really approach it on the same critical level that I sometimes do for other lesser known works, just because I feel so much has already been said, even on YouTube. I'm instead going to speak about my personal impressions and connections that I drew rather than really try to analyze it in any particular way. I'm not really super familiar with the context of the novel or of literature at the time, which I think actually makes it a bit more challenging to get into starting out, coming from a place of reading mostly novels that are fairly stylistically different. But part of my entry into the world of this book was naturally just from drawing these automatic mental connections to other things I've read lately. So I'll mention a few of those. In theory, Jane Austen's works seem like one of the more similar things I've read recently, but aside from being 19th century English literature with prominent romance plots, I found them quite different than Jane Eyre. Jane Austen's novels, beneath their deeper themes, have heavy satirical elements to them, whereas Jane Eyre, though maybe containing a little moments of satire, is more, well, I don't know exactly what to call it in technical terms, because this is where my not having studied it academically fails me, but I would say it's not really quite realist, but it's meant to depict a sort of emotional truth to us as it appears to the character of Jane, which is reflected not only in Jane's internal monologues about herself, which we do get to see, but also even in the way she experiences and describes the world about her. Sometimes bleak, sometimes beautiful, but almost always very moving and impression forming on her. In Jane Austen's novels, the protagonists are still centered in the narrative, but are also placed under a higher level of critical scrutiny by the reader, whereas in Jane Eyre, the protagonist is the narrator herself, and thus we see directly into her internal and emotional world without any level of critical interjection from a third-person observer. In fact, some critics have apparently observed that in reading Jane Eyre, partly for this reason, although I think partly also due to Jane's own nature, readers may be tempted to align entirely and unquestioningly with Jane, whereas with Jane Austen's heroines, the readers may be rooting for them, but also will probably view them almost all the time with at least some criticism. Jane Eyre, the character, after all, has some characteristics that would be considered flaws depending on the reader's point of view, but has few really clear flaws to readers nowadays that would be universally agreed as faults by all readers. Thus, without knowing a ton about the novel, I can see how it might have been controversial at the time it was published, because any characteristic or quality that Jane assumes in this novel, any decision she makes by the end of the novel, assumes by association with her, since she's a good character, a certain air of moral correctness or a certain value judgment inherent to it. Even if in some cases, and in several especially prominent decisions she makes, there's arguably not just one correct moral choice that could be made. Another explicit linkage that surprised and interested me right from the start was the dedication by Charlotte Brontë of the second edition of this novel to William Makepeace Thackeray, author of another satirical masterpiece, Vanity Fair, which I read 2 years ago in the summer and again feels to me quite stylistically different than Jane Eyre. More similar to Jane Austen's work, I would argue, though certainly still very distinguishable from that as well. Another note of connection, it was maybe somewhat helpful to have read it around the time right after reading some Sherlock Holmes short stories, because some of that mysterious atmosphere of Sherlock Holmes is present here as well. I will note, of course, that Jane Eyre was published earlier, so I'm not trying to imply that Brontë was influenced by Sherlock Holmes. If anything, it would have been the reverse, but definitely some of the similar impressions that I got from this. Another book that I was thinking about inevitably as I read this one was her little sister's book, Wuthering Heights. I mean, maybe this is going to make some people just stop watching the video right now, but I'm not really a fan of Wuthering Heights. I did some work after reading Wuthering Heights to understand its significance and what people really appreciate about it, and I very much respect that. I do think it's a classic. It's influential. It's well written and everything. I just didn't particularly enjoy it, and maybe that just means I'm not mature enough of a reader to enjoy it yet, or I wasn't at the time I read it. maybe it's an opportunity to read a book and try to think of it in terms other than just I liked it or I disliked it, to see what other impressions it invokes. Maybe someday I'll return to Wuthering Heights again and see it differently, but for now, I just don't really like it. Anyway, Jane Eyre has some similar atmospheric and gothic elements to it, but I find Jane Eyre more enjoyable, and it compares favorably in my eyes to Wuthering Heights due to the strength of its central protagonist. And sure, some might argue that Jane, as a protagonist who's pretty easy to like and uncontroversial nowadays, though not at the time of writing, I'm sure, pretty easy to view as good, is less interesting of a focal character than someone like Heathcliff, a troubled character whom readers will find sympathetic at times, but also have a hard time accepting as a proper hero. Certainly, even more than they'll have trouble accepting someone like Edward Rochester in Jane Eyre. So perhaps Jane Eyre is the softer or more accessible of the two novels, but I'm willing to move on from this and consider Jane Eyre mostly on its own terms as a novel with a true traditional heroine, but one who's also perhaps different from literary heroines that existed prior to her. Aesthetically and stylistically, I guess I also got a little bit of a sense of what I read in The Woman in White by Wilkie Collins, for whatever that's worth, with a little bit of the spookiness, a little bit of seeming sensationalism at times, a sense that perhaps something supernatural is going on, but probably not, but just maybe. And additionally, with this sort of terrifying gothic element where there are all these implications of one of the characters controlling or having complete power over one or more of the other characters, which in some sense maybe actually was true at the time. And in fact, I'll return to this aspect of control because it definitely stands out as an important theme in some places here. On the other hand, Jane Eyre stands out to me a lot from, say, The Woman in White, because for me in Jane Eyre, the character development is really more central and it's deeper. Whereas in The Woman in White, there is some character development, but often it sort of takes the backdrop to this plot itself and this whole mystery intrigue element of just what on earth is going on here. Jane Eyre has an interesting plot, but I'd argue that it's not that complicated of a plot, especially for its length. In fact, that is one thing that made it a bit challenging for me to read sometimes on this first ever read. Although in the end, I don't think it's necessarily such a bad thing. But in most chapters of Jane Eyre, there's lots of scene setting, lots of internal monologues and impressions, lots of conversations, but usually just like one key plot development that occurs. I think you could summarize the plot of Jane Eyre very succinctly in a way that wouldn't, of course, capture the essence of the book, but would tell you at least what happens. Of course, you could probably also do the same with Woman in White, but the difference is that I think in The Woman in White, the chapters up until some revelation focus more on building up suspense and intrigue with some character development, but really just hinting at the next big reveal. Whereas in Jane Eyre, it's more centered on the characters, in my opinion, and then the plot points are also important, but just arise sort of more organically as part of the novel. One other book with themes that came up in my mind as I was reading Jane Eyre, which will be the wild card of the bunch, and that would be Sally Rooney's Intermezzo, very much because I read that book basically immediately the week it came out as a sort of intermezzo of my reading of Jane Eyre. But honestly, I feel that reading the two side by side really enhanced my experience of both of them. I'll probably do a separate interview on Intermezzo soon, but in short, I really enjoyed that book, much more than I enjoyed Rooney's previous novel, Beautiful World, Where Are You?, which I found kind of disappointing. One common thread that I saw running through both Jane Eyre and Intermezzo, though, was the way in which we and the other people around us in our lives together establish our own sense of identity, and how, therefore, we feel pressured, for better and for worse, to act in ways that are consistent with that identity, partially for our own good, but also partially to satisfy the expectations of everyone around us, just because we do live in a society, and just going rogue and doing everything your own way is not really actually a satisfying or fulfilling way to live. Both Jane Eyre and the central characters in Intermezzo face these situations that they are what you would call moral situations, even if maybe in Intermezzo in particular, there's this sort of question sitting in the background as to whether these situations really have such moral gravity to them in a cosmic sense. But I'm going to call them moral quandaries here because they're situations in which the characters' hearts and their own senses of the way things should be, and perhaps readers' sense as well of how things should be, conflicts with society's moral expectations or their family's expectations or even their own sense of how they view themselves. And they make these decisions because you have to make a decision, but they don't really reach any sense of closure that this was the proper decision. This decision has real negative consequences, and yet they conversely know that if they had made the opposite decision, they would still be equally and perhaps even more unsatisfied. I mean, Jane does maybe receive some closure or finality in some of her decisions towards the end of the novel, but this is a long time coming, and also many of the circumstances have changed by then. So I think some of her earlier decisions are still not necessarily clear-cut in whether they were right or wrong, even looking back on them from the end of the novel. You see, I find the influence of this personal sense of identity fascinating because, well, maybe to many readers this may just feel like a cliche at this point, but to me it's not yet. I mean, first of all, we know that a person's identity is something with plasticity or flexibility. Some of us may be allowing more flexibility than others, but someone who tries to maintain a completely rigid sense of identity is likely to become, honestly, I think it would lead to a sort of personality or psychological disorder, or at least some obsessive drive to continually explain one's life within this rigid idea of our identity that is kind of impossible to maintain. Do you believe that you're a good or moral person in some absolute sense? Well, then when something suddenly happens and in the spur of the moment you do something that in hindsight you will feel with certainty is immoral and you can't justify, and then you're really stuck because how can you be a good person if you've now done something immoral? Arguably, the character St. John in Jane Eyre maybe is sort of an example of one of the more rigid characters. He completely negates his own emotional world and, for example, his romantic attractions and personal desires in subservience to the will of God in a way that, as I'll get to it in a bit, I actually find quite admirable as a character trait, but also see as stifling and as a warning to me and to readers about holding such a rigid point of view. And yet having some fixed, or at least relatively immobile, sense of identity is such an important stabilizing force within our lives, and Jane really experiences that. How would we relate to our friends, our family, our romantic partners if we simply walked through the world with an amorphous identity that just took the shape each day of whatever mood we happen to be in? One day I'm out making lunches for the poor, and the next I'm insulting them or disparaging them. It's not that these contradictions never exist in the same person, but they do trouble us when we think about them, and from most of us they demand some sort of reconciliation or form of adding order and explanation to them. And in particular, I find that the biggest challenges for me in the world, but also my biggest opportunities for personal growth, come at these moments where I suddenly realize, or gradually realize even, some kind of dissonance or tension between the different values I hold or the way I behave in certain circumstances, in different circumstances. And I'm forced to either act the same way but reformulate my idea of myself, my identity, in a way that can allow that apparent dissonance to not really be a dissonance, to be more coherent. Or I'm forced to change the way I behave to become more consistent with this idea of myself. Or maybe I do a little bit of both. But let's bring this back to Jane Eyre now. Jane views herself as a moral person, and Jane is also a romantic, committed to concepts such as love. And she finds herself at a point where these two values, these two parts of her identity, can no longer coexist. This is just one such example in the story of Jane Eyre, of course. I find Jane's identity is challenged by various characters and situations throughout the novel, but I'm going to focus just for a moment on this most central conflict, and also say here at this point that I am going to start talking about stuff that would be really considered spoilers if you haven't already read the novel. So just a quick warning there, and I'll pause for a moment in case you, like me, are 30 years or 20 years or whatever behind the curve in reading this novel. So Jane finds herself in the middle of the novel in this dilemma where she finds that the man she loves, Mr. Rochester, is already legally married to another woman, and she has to decide whether to stay with him in some form or another. One option here would be to say basically what Mr. Rochester said to himself at his darkest time in life, and what apparently prevented him from committing suicide there. He basically says, you know what? These human rules of morality are ridiculous. I am not actually married to this lunatic woman. I reject this whole convention. I was tricked. It's off. I'm not married. It's not a question of immorality. I'm not saying that morality doesn't exist, but it is perfectly moral for you to marry me, Jane, because although bigamy is wrong, This is not bigamy. This is moral. I'm not married. So here you're reworking the terms so that the apparent contradiction is no longer really a contradiction. You don't have to change your behavior or your sense of yourself. You don't have to let go of either of these propositions. You basically get to keep them both. Also, if you were to say that this is bigamy, but bigamy actually is moral, that would be a similar way of reconciling these conflicting values of one's identity, although that's not what I understand to be happening here with Mr. Rochester. However, we can't always take this road because sometimes, as in Jane's case, our own sense of conscience and the sense of those around us means it's not really an option or not a good option. Now that she knows Mr. Rochester already has a wife, Jane simply cannot convince herself, let alone the rest of the community, that she's still a moral person if she stays with him and marries him. Or stays with him, period. This leaves her with two other options now. Jane could say that she is a moral person, committed to God, but Jane is first and foremost a romantic, committed to Mr. Rochester. This is her highest value, and therefore she must stay and marry Mr. Rochester and must answer to God for it someday. Or she could say that she is a romantic person committed to Mr. Rochester, but she is first and foremost a moral person committed to God, a higher power, and therefore she must leave Mr. Rochester. And this is the option she actually takes. However, true to her romantic notions, she eventually does refuse to marry someone else who doesn't love her, though she very deeply considers changing this part of her former sense of identity in this way. But this just shows that she hasn't completely forsaken her identity as a romantic. She just has recognized that that is not her highest value. So I think it's a beautiful aspect of life, forming our identities and adhering to them, yet remaining open to possibilities for change, not clinging too tightly to them or viewing them too rigidly. And I think it's fundamental to this book, and also really an important element of Intermezzo by Sally Rooney, which I'll likely discuss even more if I do a review on that book. Now, let me now talk about one other character and dynamic that I found really interesting towards the end of the novel. Upon leaving Mr. Rochester, Jane goes to work for and eventually live with a character, St. John, which is written St. John but pronounced St. John, I learned since I was listening to the audiobook, a man whom she later discovers to in fact be her cousin in a sort of this could never happen in real life, but whatever moment. Hugh is, I think, a curate. I'm not sure. He's a religious leader in some sense and has a very strong sense of dedication and duty towards God and towards his flock of parishioners. He's to become a missionary by the end of the novel. I found the man St. John an excellent character, and in particular, excellent in his relation to Jane. We really learn a lot about the woman Jane has become and still is becoming through her relationship with St. John. She allows herself to be molded by him, but only up until a certain point where she feels on the verge of losing the shape of her own identity altogether. Speaking first, though, about St. John himself, I personally really admire his own consistency in his way of viewing the world, despite that I'm glad Jane does not have the same view. I imagine many modern readers may not view him so favorably, but I have enormous respect for him. Even if he represents a rather old-fashioned point of view that may have already been on the way out, it at least can be said that he is no hypocrite. Without naming any names here, this is why I respect politicians of the sort who maybe disagree with me fundamentally on a lot of issues, but I really believe that they actually believe in what they're standing up for, and that they are not merely using their platform for political gain as an end in itself, but actually believe that in whatever values they hold. And I really want to emphasize, I mean this even for people who, I wouldn't necessarily vote for, because I think, I don't actually agree with their views, but I think they really believe in what they stand for, and I have to respect them a little bit for that. And this is one part that I really appreciated about this aspect of the novel. I love how Jane has this deep maturity in being able to say as well, look, if this is how you want to live your life, I respect that and I admire it, but at the same time, it is not how I'm going to live my life, and I am comfortable with my own decision, even though, and this has to be St. John's biggest flaw, even though you are not able to understand my point of view in the same way that I understand yours. Though perhaps by the end of the book, St. John does even somewhat come around here, I tend to think not entirely, but we at least learn at the end of the novel that he and Jane remain upon cordial terms until the end of his life, and correspond occasionally in writing. So, this concept of personal identity that I've said up until now is so important to this novel. Does Jane in the end give up or betray her independence and identity in the end in marrying Mr. Rochester? I don't really think so, as it stands at the end of the book. If she had married him the first time, towards the middle of the book, as she was slated to do, regardless of what we were to learn about his imprisoned secret wife in the attic, well, I think that a part of her was resistant to this all along. Like, when I was reading the conversations between them towards the middle of the book when they were preparing to get married, I like to think it was sort of the intention for this part to feel kind of disturbing, like, not just from a modern reader's perspective, but even reading at the time, like, something about this man is not quite right. I don't really know, for especially a woman like you in particular, if it's a good idea for you to be giving up your life for him like this. And we see some resistance on Jane's part to this marriage, and we even see another character, Mrs. Fairfax, warning Jane, I think you're walking into a minefield here, even if you're enamored with this man right now, he's a little dangerous. And we see how even before encountering this ghostly apparition in the middle of the night, Jane already had qualms about going through with this marriage. In general, Rochester speaks about her and treats her in a rather possessive way that maybe seeks to control her too much for us to be able to envision this as really a happy marriage for her, and a fulfilling marriage for her. So yeah, if this marriage had actually come together at the time it was originally planned, I think I would have felt very differently about the ending. So then why does it, at the end, feel right, at least to me? While both characters have separately gone through individual ordeals, let's say, they have strengthened their characters in a way that makes them suitable for one another now, in a way that I think they really weren't before. Jane, in asserting her independence and declining to marry her cousin St. John, albeit in a bit of a close call for her, has set her own priorities straight and really affirmed that she finds it critical to be on an equal status to that of her husband, or at least in the ways that are feasible within this society she lives in. Mr. Rochester has been humbled, has been forced to demonstrate his valor and his loyalty in trying his best to save his true wife, though, as expected from the middle of the novel, she is ultimately still conveniently removed from this world so as to eliminate the troubling remaining obstacle to a union between Jane and Mr. Rochester. And in the sort of convenient circumstances that arise in the intervening period, Jane is suddenly a rich heiress, Mr. Rochester is suddenly lame and blind, and the two in their reunion are now brought into a relation in which they are now more of equals in social status. So in the end, then, their final union does feel right. The only thing that sits sort of uneasily is the fact that many of these circumstances were arrived at by mere luck and coincidence. Like, it could have easily happened that there was no wife in the attic and the two got married earlier in the novel and Jane entered into a marriage that I think would have been a lot less fulfilling a relationship and a life for Jane, and could have turned out pretty badly. In the end, though, this more equal power dynamic is also facilitated by the elevation of Jane's social status and the demotion of Rochester's social status, or at least his wealth and his physical abilities. But this is a work of fiction after all, and I'm not really too concerned upon the amount of coincidence or the unlikeliness of certain happenings here. Instead, I'm really more just interested in seeing what the emotional truth that I can get out of this novel is. So I realize this has delved pretty deep into analysis and explanation beyond merely what I would just call impressions. How did I like the book? Well, I enjoyed it. The part I enjoyed most was getting to see Jane's character. She is a wonderful person to follow. I think there's a lot to emulate in the mature and thoughtful way in which she lives her life and interacts with those around her. I can certainly see why she's such a beloved heroine and why this is such a beloved novel. The writing itself, the descriptions of Thornfield Hall and the other settings in the novel, it's beautiful and evocative, but not in a way that I always found the most personally captivating, at least on this read. Given how much others have appreciated this aspect, I'm fine to call this just a point of personal preference, and I don't know even if I were to read it again at a different time, would it affect me in a different way. All I can say is that upon this particular reading of the novel, I found myself very drawn into the plot and the characters, and often as a result, some of the longer descriptions or even the more drawn-out internal monologues took me out of parts of the novel that I was finding most interesting, rather than drawing me in more deeply. I know for some this probably means that I'm just not experiencing the novel quite in the most satisfying way to experience it, which may be true, but if so, that's just how it was this time. I can give it a chance, but I can't force it. It definitely feels to me, though, like a book that one would definitely enjoy, perhaps quite a bit more even on a second read, knowing that everything will eventually turn out, and even just having more of a sense of the context or the themes or the vibe of the book. A reader like me might then be able to focus more on other aspects, whether it's the aesthetic detail or the foreshadowing or more subtle character traits than even what I've focused on so far and how they change or don't throughout the novel. So maybe someday I'll pick this one up again, but not for a while. Happy reading.